Welcome to the world of science fiction, where extraordinary stories come to life. If you've subscribed for more stories, enjoy the ride now. The first thing David Kane noticed about the figure collapsed in the snow outside his research station wasn't that she was naked, though in retrospect that detail probably should have demanded more immediate attention. The first thing he noticed was that she was still breathing, which on the frozen surface of Erebus 4 was remarkable enough to qualify as a minor miracle. The second thing he noticed, as he rushed through the howling wind to reach her, was that she definitely wasn't human. The pointed ears and silver-streaked skin marking her as Stellarian were unmistakable, even half buried in the Arctic snow that should have killed her within minutes of exposure. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, creating tiny puffs of vapor that dissipated instantly in the sub-zero air. "Oh, hell," David muttered, scooping her up in his arms and noting absently that she weighed significantly less than a human of similar size would. Her skin was ice-cold to the touch, but her alien physiology must have been providing some protection against the elements that would have been instantly fatal to him without his environmental suit. As he carried her toward the station's airlock, the woman stirred slightly in his arms, her luminous blue eyes opening just enough to focus on his face through his helmet visor. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind, "when they come looking, please pretend I'm your wife." David almost stumbled, certain he'd misheard her over the storm. "What? Your wife," she repeated with obvious effort, her words slurring slightly from cold and exhaustion. "Please. It's the only way they can't take me." Before David could ask who they were or what she was talking about, she lost consciousness again, leaving him to carry an unconscious, naked alien woman into his research station while trying to process the most bizarre request he'd ever received. The station's medical bay was designed for treating minor injuries sustained during geological surveys, not for reversing severe hypothermia in unknown alien physiologies. David worked quickly to activate the emergency warming protocols while scanning her vital signs with equipment that was probably inadequate for Stellarian biology but was the best he had available. "Come on," he muttered, adjusting the atmospheric heaters and wrapping her in thermal blankets. "Whatever brought you out here, it can't have been worth freezing to death over." As her body temperature gradually stabilized, David found himself studying her features more carefully. Stellarians were considered one of the more aesthetically compatible alien species with humans, but he'd never been this close to one before. Her silver-streaked skin had an almost luminescent quality, and her pointed ears were more delicate and graceful than the crude descriptions in xenobiology textbooks had suggested. More immediately relevant was the question of how she'd ended up naked and alone on one of the most inhospitable moons in the sector. Erebus 4 had no permanent settlements, no regular traffic, and weather patterns that could kill the unprepared in minutes. The nearest inhabited system was 3 days' travel by conventional transport. When she began to stir again, David was ready with warm broth and a medical scanner, though he had no idea whether either would be appropriate for Stellarian physiology. "Easy," he said softly as her eyes opened and immediately began darting around the medical bay with obvious alarm. "You're safe. You're in a research station on Erebus 4. I'm David Kane, and I found you outside about 2 hours ago." "2 hours?" she asked, her voice stronger than before but carrying an accent that made even standard words sound musical. "They could already be here. You have to understand, when they arrive, you have to pretend you're my wife," David finished. "Yes, you mentioned that before you passed out. Care to explain why?" The woman struggled to sit up, pulling the thermal blankets around herself with obvious modesty despite their recent intimate proximity during his life-saving efforts. "My name is Naia. I was, betrothed to Lord Kazeth of House Thorian. And Lord Kazeth is someone you'd rather not marry, I'm guessing?" David asked, settling into a chair beside the medical bed. "Lord Kazeth is someone who views wives as particularly valuable pieces of property," Naia corrected, her tone carrying bitter experience. "Under Stellarian law, unmarried females who are found alone can be legally claimed by any male who provides them shelter or assistance." David stared at her. "That's barbaric." "That's traditional," Naia said dryly. However, married females are considered the exclusive property of their husbands and cannot be legally claimed by others. It's the only protection available under our legal system. So you're asking me to pretend to be married to you to protect you from being claimed by someone else? I'm asking you to save my life, Naia said simply. Because if the retrieval teams find me here as an unmarried female, they will return me to Lord Kazeth, who has made it very clear that runaway wives receive educational correction that often proves fatal. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's heating system. How did you end up here? On Erebus 4, I mean. Escape pod malfunction, Naia explained, unconsciously touching her throat where David could now see faint bruising that suggested recent violence. My life support suit was torn away during atmospheric entry. I managed to activate a distress beacon before I collapsed, but I set it to broadcast on private channels only. I was hoping to find someone who might help rather than someone who would simply return me to my owner. Your owner, David repeated, his voice flat with disgust. My betrothed, Naia corrected with dark humor. Though the distinction is largely semantic under Stellarian marriage law. David stood up and began pacing the small medical bay, his mind racing through the implications of what she was asking. This pretend marriage thing, how would it work? What would I need to know? The basic legal requirements are simple, Naia said, hope flickering in her blue eyes for the first time since he'd found her. We would need to demonstrate cohabitation, mutual financial support, and emotional intimacy sufficient to convince investigators that our bond is genuine. Emotional intimacy, David said slowly. Meaning? Meaning you would need to act like you love me, Naia said quietly. And I would need to act like I love you. Convincingly enough that trained investigators would believe our relationship is real. David stopped pacing and looked at her directly. And what happens to you if we can't pull it off? I get returned to Lord Kazeth for correction and education, Naia said with forced lightness. Assuming I survive the process, I then get to spend the rest of my life as a properly obedient wife who understands that escape attempts result in consequences. That's not going to happen, David said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. I don't know how to fake being married, and I have no experience with Stellarian culture, but if you're willing to trust me, I'm willing to try. Naia's eyes filled with tears, though whether from relief or gratitude or simple exhaustion, David couldn't tell. You would do this for me? Even though we just met? Even though it could put you in danger? I would do this because someone who risks death to escape an abusive situation deserves help from anyone capable of providing it, David replied. And because the idea of someone being treated as property makes me angry enough to take risks. Thank you, Naia whispered. I know it's an enormous favor to ask from a stranger. Well, David said with a slight smile, I guess we won't be strangers much longer. If we're going to convince people we're married, we should probably start by learning each other's favorite foods and embarrassing childhood stories. Despite everything she'd been through, Naia actually laughed. David Kane, if you can make me laugh while I'm naked, hypothermic, and terrified for my life, you might be surprisingly good at this fake husband business. Let's hope so, David said, already wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Because something tells me our relationship is about to get very complicated, very quickly. 3 days into their impromptu marriage, David discovered that learning to be convincingly in love with someone was significantly more complicated than he'd anticipated, especially when that someone was currently wearing his spare research coveralls and attempting to teach him the finer points of Stellarian domestic customs while monitoring his communication logs for surveillance patterns. The key to believable marital interaction, Naia explained, perched on his desk chair with her legs tucked under her like a cat, is understanding that Stellarian marriage investigators look for specific behavioral indicators. Shared personal space, unconscious physical contact, and synchronized daily routines that suggest genuine cohabitation rather than performance. Synchronized daily routines, David repeated, trying to focus on her words rather than the way she looked unexpectedly comfortable in his oversized work clothes. Such as Such as the fact that we should probably know each other's preferred sleeping schedules, dietary restrictions, and personal habits well enough to reference them casually during questioning, Naia said, then grinned with the first genuine humor he'd seen from her. For instance, I should probably know whether you snore, since we're supposedly sharing a bed. David felt heat rise in his cheeks. I don't snore. At least, I don't think I do. Do you? Only when I'm exhausted or stressed, Naia replied matter-of-factly. Which means I've probably been snoring for the past 3 nights. I hope that hasn't been too disruptive to your research schedule. You've been sleeping in the guest quarters, David pointed out. I wouldn't know if you snore. Exactly the kind of detail that would immediately expose our deception, Naia said with satisfaction that suggested she was enjoying their crash course in fictional domesticity. A real husband would know his wife's sleeping habits intimately. David saved his current research file and turned to face her fully. Okay, so what do we do about that? I mean, obviously we can't actually share a bed, but we need to know details that would suggest we do. We could share a bed without sharing a bed, Naia suggested thoughtfully. Take turns using it, but make sure we both have realistic knowledge of the other person's sleeping patterns. I could sleep there tonight while you work late, you could use it tomorrow while I'm organizing the kitchen to look more like a shared domestic space. That could work, David agreed, though the thought of Naia sleeping in his bed, even when he wasn't in it, created a flutter of something in his chest that was definitely more personal than their situation required. What other behavioral indicators do investigators look for? Physical comfort with each other, Naia said, and David noticed that her silver-streaked skin darkened slightly when she was embarrassed, which was probably information he didn't need to find as charming as he did. Married couples touch each other unconsciously, hand on shoulder when passing, casual contact during conversation, automatic adjustment of personal space to accommodate the other person. And we currently interact like polite strangers, David observed. Exactly. Which means we need to practice being physically comfortable with each other without it being awkward or obvious. Naia stood up and moved closer to him, her expression becoming more serious. David, I need you to understand something. What I'm asking you to do, it requires a level of intimacy that goes beyond just helping someone in trouble. We need to learn to act like people who love each other, which means crossing boundaries that normal friendships don't cross. David studied her face, noting the way her luminous blue eyes reflected both determination and vulnerability. Are you worried about my motivations? I'm worried about mine, Naia admitted quietly. You saved my life, you're risking your safety to protect me, and you're being kinder to me than anyone has been in years. That's dangerous territory for someone in my situation. Dangerous how? David asked, though he thought he might already know the answer. Dangerous because it would be very easy for me to mistake gratitude and relief for something deeper, Naia said honestly. And because developing real feelings for you would complicate our arrangement in ways that could put both of us at risk. David felt something twist in his stomach at her words. And that's something you're concerned about happening? Naia was quiet for a long moment before answering. David, when someone shows you kindness after months of cruelty, when someone treats you like a person instead of property, when someone risks themselves to keep you safe, yes, developing feelings is a very real possibility. Would that be such a terrible thing? David asked softly. It would be a complication neither of us can afford, Naia replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by her own argument. This arrangement only works if we can maintain appropriate boundaries while successfully performing appropriate intimacy. Right, David said, trying to ignore the disappointment that accompanied his understanding of her position. So we need to learn to act like we're in love without actually falling in love. Exactly, Naia confirmed, though she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. Think of it as method acting. We become convincing by understanding the roles we're playing without losing ourselves in them. Before David could respond, his communication console chimed with an incoming transmission alert. They both froze as the display showed an official Stellarian government seal and a priority authentication code. They're here, Naia whispered, her face going pale beneath her silver-streaked skin. David, this is it. Everything we've talked about, everything we've planned, it's about to be tested for real. David activated the communication link, his hand automatically finding Naia's shoulder in what he hoped looked like a gesture of casual marital support. This is Research Station Erebus 7, David Kane speaking. Mr. Kane, this is Commander Throck of the Stellarian Enforcement Division. We have reason to believe you may be harboring a fugitive female from justice. We are requesting permission to board your station and conduct an inspection. Naia's hand covered David's where it rested on her shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly as she squeezed his with what felt like desperation disguised as affection. I'm not harboring anyone, Commander, David replied, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Though my wife and I would be happy to cooperate with your investigation if you believe it's necessary. Your wife? Commander Throck's voice sharpened with obvious interest. Our records do not indicate that you are married, Mr. Kane. We were married 6 months ago, David said smoothly, following the story he and Naia had carefully constructed. My wife is Naia Kane, formerly of House Astrolux. She joined me on Erebus 4 after our ceremony. There was a pause that seemed to last forever before Commander Throck responded. We will be docking with your station in 20 minutes, Mr. Kane. Please have your wife available for questioning, along with all relevant documentation regarding your marriage. The communication link closed, leaving David and Naia staring at each other in the sudden silence of the research station. Well, Naia said with forced lightness, though her hand was still gripping his with white-knuckle intensity, I hope you're a better actor than you think you are. Because in 20 minutes, we're either going to pull off the performance of our lives, or I'm going to find out what Lord Kazefa's idea of educational correction actually involves. David turned his hand to clasp hers properly, their fingers interlocking in what he hoped looked like loving support rather than mutual terror. Naia, whatever happens, I want you to know that helping you has been the most important thing I've ever done. And if we can pull this off, if we can convince them that we're really married, then maybe we'll have time to figure out what comes next. What comes next, Naia said quietly, is that we discover whether pretending to be in love is something we can sustain long-term, or whether it's something that will eventually destroy us both. As they waited for Commander Throck's arrival, David realized that somewhere between planning their deception and preparing for its first real test, the line between pretense and reality had become significantly more blurred than either of them had intended. Commander Throck was exactly the kind of Stellarian male that made David understand why Naia had risked death to escape her arranged marriage. Tall, imposing, with the kind of arrogant bearing that suggested he viewed other beings as inconveniences to be managed rather than people to be respected. His pale silver skin was marked with the ritual scarring that indicated high military rank, and his pointed ears were adorned with jewelry that probably cost more than David's entire research budget. Mr. Kane, Throck said without preamble as he entered the station's main living area, flanked by 2 equally intimidating enforcement officers. And Mrs. Kane, I presume? Naia rose from the couch where she'd been sitting beside David, her posture somehow managing to convey both respect for Throck's authority and comfortable familiarity with her husband. Commander Throck. How may we assist you? David noted with admiration that Naia had transformed herself completely from the terrified fugitive he'd found 3 days ago. She moved with the confident grace of someone comfortable in her own home, and her voice carried just the right mixture of politeness and mild irritation at being interrupted in her domestic routine. You may assist me by explaining how you came to be married to a human researcher on a remote ice moon, Throck replied, his keen eyes taking in every detail of their living space. Our records indicate no formal marriage registration with Stellarian authorities. Because we were married in a human ceremony, David interjected, moving to stand beside Naia in what he hoped looked like automatic spousal solidarity. The paperwork is filed with the Terran Colonial Administration. How convenient, Throck said dryly. And how did you two meet? Romance between species is uncommon. Naia's hand found David's, their fingers intertwining with the kind of unconscious ease they'd been practicing for days. I was part of a diplomatic mission to the research colony on Titan Station. David was presenting his geological findings to the Scientific Council. We connected over a shared fascination with planetary formation. Planetary formation, Throck repeated with obvious skepticism. How romantic. You'd be surprised, David said with a smile that felt more genuine than he'd expected. Naia understood the gravitational dynamics of my research better than most of my colleagues. Intelligence is very attractive. Throck's expression suggested he found the concept of intelligence being attractive to be foreign and possibly suspicious. Mrs. Kane, your family has reported you missing. They are quite concerned about your welfare. My family was quite concerned about the political advantages of my arranged marriage, Naia replied smoothly. When I chose love over obligation, they naturally felt that reporting me missing would be more palatable than admitting their daughter had defied their wishes. You abandoned your betrothal to Lord Kazeth to marry a human? Throck asked, his tone indicating that he found this explanation even more unbelievable than planetary formation as a basis for romance. I abandoned a business arrangement disguised as a betrothal to marry someone who sees me as a partner rather than an acquisition, Naia corrected, her voice carrying just enough edge to suggest that she found his questions offensive. David felt a surge of admiration for the way Naia was handling the interrogation. She was answering every question with responses that sounded completely believable while simultaneously expressing subtle defiance of the cultural assumptions underlying Throck's inquiry. Mr. Kane, Throck said, turning his attention to David, what exactly do you find appealing about Stellarian women? Most humans prefer their own species for intimate relationships. Most humans haven't met Naia, David replied without hesitation, surprised by how easy it was to speak honestly about her qualities. She's brilliant, brave, funny, and has the kind of inner strength that makes you want to be worthy of her attention. Species differences seem pretty insignificant compared to finding someone who challenges you to be a better person. Naia's hand squeezed his, and when he glanced at her, he saw something in her expression that looked dangerously close to real emotion rather than performance. How touching, Throck said with obvious sarcasm. Mrs. Kane, I notice you're wearing human clothing. Do you not maintain traditional Stellarian dress in your household? I wear whatever is practical for our environment and circumstances, Naia replied calmly. David's coveralls are warmer than formal robes in sub-zero temperatures, and comfort is more important to me than rigid adherence to tradition. Your husband allows you to make such choices? Throck asked, his tone suggesting this was evidence of improper marriage management. My husband respects my judgment about my own clothing, Naia said, her voice cooling noticeably. It's one of the many advantages of marrying someone who views his wife as an intelligent adult rather than a decorative possession. Throck's eyes narrowed at the implied criticism of traditional Stellarian marriage practices. Mrs. Kane, I need to speak with you privately. Standard procedure for questioning females in mixed-species households. David felt Naia tense beside him, though her expression remained perfectly calm. Of course, Commander. Though I should mention that my husband and I don't keep secrets from each other. Anything you need to ask me can be asked in his presence. Nevertheless, private questioning is required, Throck insisted, gesturing toward one of his officers. Mr. Kane, you will wait here while we conduct our interview. Actually, David said, his protective instincts overriding diplomatic caution, my wife has the right to have me present during questioning if she chooses. Terran marriage law grants spouses certain advocacy privileges. Throck stared at him with obvious irritation. This is not Terran territory, Mr. Kane. But I am a Terran citizen married to a Stellarian who chose to adopt human legal protections through our marriage, David replied evenly. Which creates a rather interesting jurisdictional question, doesn't it? For a moment, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Throck smiled coldly and said, very well. Mrs. Kane, please demonstrate the legitimacy of your marriage by showing appropriate wifely affection toward your husband. David felt his stomach drop as he realized what Throck was demanding. The commander wanted proof of their intimate relationship, and there was only one way to provide that proof convincingly. Naia turned toward him, her luminous blue eyes meeting his with a mixture of apology and determination. David, she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of tender intimacy that made his heart skip despite knowing it was performance. Ignore him. Show me that I matter more to you than his games. Before David could overthink the situation, Naia rose on her tiptoes and kissed him. What began as a desperate attempt at convincing performance transformed almost instantly into something genuine and electric. Her lips were soft and warm, and when her hand curved around the back of his neck, David forgot completely that they had an audience. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and David realized that whatever had just happened between them had gone far beyond acting. Satisfactory, Throck said with obvious distaste. Your marriage appears to be authentic. We will be departing now. Mrs. Kane, you should contact your family. They are concerned about your welfare. I'll consider it, Naia replied, though her attention remained focused on David rather than the commander. After Throck and his officers left, David and Naia stood in the sudden silence of their living space, still close enough to feel each other's warmth, still connected by the aftermath of a kiss that had started as deception and ended as revelation. So, Naia said finally, her voice slightly unsteady, that was either excellent acting, or we have a problem. What kind of problem? David asked, though he was pretty sure he already knew. The kind where pretending to be in love accidentally becomes actually being in love, Naia replied quietly. The kind where our carefully maintained boundaries just got completely obliterated by a kiss that felt more real than anything either of us expected. David reached up to touch her face gently, his thumb tracing the silver patterns in her skin. Would that be such a terrible problem to have? It would be the best problem I've ever had, Naia admitted, leaning into his touch. And also the most terrifying, because it means we have to figure out what happens next when our fake marriage becomes something we actually want to be real. 6 months later, David woke up to the sound of quiet voices in his kitchen and the smell of something that might have been breakfast if breakfast typically involved ingredients from 3 different star systems. Rolling out of bed, he found Naia teaching 2 other Stellarian women how to modify human food preparation equipment for their dietary requirements, while a 3rd woman sat at his expanded dining table, carefully filling out what looked like legal documents. Good morning, husband, Naia said with the smile that had become his favorite way to start each day. I hope we didn't wake you. Lissa and Kira arrived during the night shift, and Xania is helping them file refugee status applications with the Terran Colonial Administration. No problem, David replied, accepting the cup of coffee Naia handed him with the automatic domesticity they'd developed over months of genuine partnership. Any word from the underground network about safe placement? 3 more families have volunteered to provide temporary housing on Luna Colony, Xania reported, looking up from her paperwork with obvious satisfaction. And the Legal Aid Society has agreed to represent anyone who wants to formally challenge Stellarian marriage laws through interstellar courts. David surveyed his kitchen, which had been transformed from a simple research station food preparation area into the unofficial headquarters of what the Stellarian government probably considered a criminal organization. Over the past 6 months, word had spread through underground channels that there was a place on Erebus 4 where escaped wives could find sanctuary, legal help, and a human couple willing to provide protective documentation for anyone who needed it. How many does this make? He asked Naia quietly. 17, she replied with pride. 17 women who are now legally protected from forced return to abusive marriages. 17 families that will never have to worry about their daughters being treated as property. And 1 fake marriage that turned into something beautifully real, David added, kissing the top of her head in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. About that, Naia said, her tone shifting to something more serious. David, we need to talk about our legal status. The Terran Colonial Administration has been reviewing marriage documentation for all interspecies couples, and our paperwork is creative. David felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. How creative? Creative enough that they're requesting a formal interview to confirm the legitimacy of our marriage, Naia explained. Which means we need to decide whether we want to continue our legal fiction, or whether we want to make our relationship officially real. What's the difference at this point? David asked, though he knew the question was more complex than it sounded. The difference, Xania interjected from her position at the table, is that if you're legally married for real, you can't be separated by bureaucratic review. Your union becomes permanent under both human and Stellarian law, which provides maximum protection for both of you and creates legal precedent that benefits everyone we're trying to help. And if we're not legally married for real? David asked. Then you remain vulnerable to challenges that could destroy everything we've built here, Naia said quietly. David, I need you to understand what I'm asking. Real marriage means real commitment, real partnership, real legal and emotional obligations to each other for the rest of our lives. David looked around the kitchen at the women they'd helped, at the life they'd built together, at the relationship that had grown from desperate deception into genuine love and partnership. Naia, 6 months ago you asked me to pretend to be your husband to save your life. Today I'm asking you to be my wife for real because you've become the most important part of my life. Naia's luminous blue eyes filled with tears as she moved into his arms. David Kane, are you proposing to me in our kitchen in front of 3 refugee women and a stack of legal documents? I'm proposing to you in our home, surrounded by the family we've chosen and the work we've built together, David corrected. I'm proposing because I love you, because I want to spend the rest of my life protecting people with you, and because I can't imagine being married to anyone else, fake or real. In that case, Naia said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him with the same passion that had transformed their first kiss from performance to reality, David Kane, I would be honored to be your real wife, your real partner, and your real accomplice in changing the galaxy one rescued woman at a time. The kitchen erupted in congratulations from their guests, but David barely heard them over the sound of his heart beating as he held the woman who had taught him that the best relationships began with trust, were built on mutual protection, and flourished when 2 people decided to face the universe together. 3 weeks later, David stood in a small chapel of Luna Colony Station, watching Naia walk toward him in a dress that somehow managed to honor both Stellarian tradition and human custom. The wedding guests were an eclectic mix of humans, Stellarians, and representatives from a dozen other species, all of them people whose lives had been touched by the network of protection and legal reform that had grown from their original desperate deception. You know, Naia said as they exchanged rings that would make their union official under the laws of 17 different star systems, when I asked you to pretend to be my husband, I never imagined it would lead to this. What? David asked, grinning at her. To a real wedding, or to accidentally starting an interstellar civil rights movement? To finding out that sometimes the best relationships begin with someone brave enough to say, yes, when a stranger asks for help, Naia replied. And to learning that love isn't about ownership or possession, it's about choosing to build something beautiful together. As they kissed to seal their marriage, this time for real, forever, and in front of everyone they cared about, David reflected on how their journey from desperate strangers to genuine partners had taught them both that the strongest bonds weren't forged in comfortable circumstances, but in moments when 2 people decided to trust each other with their most vulnerable truths. So, Mrs. Kane, he said as they walked back down the aisle together, officially married and unofficially committed to spending their lives helping others find the same freedom and choice they discovered together, any regrets about asking a stranger to pretend to be your husband? Only one, Naia replied with the mischievous smile that had made him fall in love with her. I regret that it took me 6 months to realize that the best fake marriage is one that turns into a real partnership built on genuine love, mutual respect, and shared commitment to making the universe a little bit safer for people who need someone to say yes when they ask for help. Lucky for us, David said, spinning her around in the corridor outside the chapel while their wedding guests cheered, we have the rest of our lives to perfect that particular art.